Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Mess. So today we're going to continue the series on the GUN4IR because you guys have been enjoying some of these tutorials I've been doing, showing you how to set up the GUN4IR on different popular emulators, especially on the arcade side. So I figured we've already talked about Sega Model 2. What else should we talk about? Obviously Sega Model 3, because the Supermodel emulator is one of my favorite emulators of any arcade board ever. It is just 10 out of 10 straight solid work as far as emulation is concerned, and pairing it with a GUN4IR is both easy and absolutely, in my opinion, essential because it is just so good. Playing something like the Lost World on my 4K television with Supermodel and using the GUN4IR as the light gun feels even better than if you're actually playing this in an arcade cabinet at arcades. It is hyper accurate and it is just so good. And if you don't have Supermodel emulator yet, definitely check it out. Just Google Supermodel emulator GitHub. It'll bring you right to the GitHub page and you can go ahead and download it from this source right here. It used to be that you would grab this emulator from their website, but now it is available on GitHub. Just make sure you pick the most recent release. It'll always be at the top of the list and it will be dated as well. And if you need a setup guide for this, I have one that's a little bit older and I'm going to be working on doing a new one soon. But when you actually get into the Supermodel emulator and the GUI, which I'll leave a link to in the description below, you may want to toggle VSync and throttle on depending on your system, because these games do have a tendency to run too fast on modern hardware. And you'll see there's also a full screen toggle, which we'll get into in just a moment. You can change around the rendering resolution from there. But on the input system for GUN4IR, X input is what you're going to want. This is what I use for all of the tests here. This is basically going to take the mouse data as well as the clicks from a mouse and transpose them over to the GUN4IR, so long as your GUN4IR is set up correctly as well, which we'll get into in the next step. But once you get this all going, playing these games on your PC with a Supermodel emulator and GUN4IR 100% flawlessly works after you go through the calibration process, and I'll show you that for the games as well in just a moment. Now on the GUN4IR software side, if you're doing the 16:9 widescreen hacks for Supermodel emulator, you want to make sure the default content mode is in full screen. If you want to make sure that you're using the original format, the 4:3 without the widescreen hacks, you want to move over to content aspect ratio if you want to use off-screen reloading. I love it in 16:9, so I'm just doing the correct aspect ratio, and if you want that widescreen, you have to toggle it right there, and you should also toggle wide background on as well, so it extends the art out. But the first thing you need to do when you go into any light gun game in Model 3 emulation is you need to calibrate the light gun, in this instance GUN4IR, for every single game you play. Every single game is going to have a slightly different methodology on how to do this. You'll see my reflection in the television there. All this is doing is asking me to set the aim. So it says pull one player or two player trigger to start, and then you're just going to basically move the gun around. It's going to read the IR sensors in real time. Because this game used IR, all you need to do is tell it where that crosshair is, and then suddenly it's going to be perfectly aligned. Don't worry about the slowdown here. I just did not have throttle toggled on, and VSync was slowing down the frame rate. But you'll see that reticle going across the screen. This is what we're dealing with when we deal with the calibration within the game. When you first start something like LA Machineguns, the calibration is not going to be correct. So you have to go in and do your aim set and then exit out of the test mode with buttons 7 and 5. That's going to be test and service. From there, once we get back into the game, we're going to have fully calibrated controls. Everything is going to be running exactly as it should, and that's what really matters. Just because you can see the reticle on the screen when you first start using GUN4IR with this emulation software does not mean the calibration will be correct, and this is just down to these settings that Sega would ship these games with, and when you run them in emulation, it's going to have those default settings enabled. Now as far as reload is concerned, for the most part, Model 3 arcade games don't have a lot of reloading. If you're playing LA Machineguns, you hold down the trigger and the shots occur. But for the games that do have reloading enabled, you can do stuff like off-screen reload, reload by button. Everything is an option here. Just make sure that you have gun mode set as mouse and keyboard. That's how it's going to work. And then from there you can bind the controls over to whatever you want. And because most games don't really use a reload on Model 3, LA Machineguns being the primary one, you can use the side button as a start button, so you're not going back to the keyboard. You can just assign the start button to being that within the GUN4IR software. That definitely does help out a lot. But as we get back into the game here, you can just see the absolute accuracy and the ability to keep shots steady with GUN4IR. I'm moving this gun around in real time, and that reticle is basically just moving when I move. There's very little jitter, there's very little float. This is as good as if you were using a mouse and just stop moving it. The GUN4IR just continually impresses me with how stable it is. I've played LA Machineguns so many different ways. Tons in the arcade, with controllers, with mice, with different light gun options for modern televisions and displays, and while they they're all effective and keep the game being fun, the GUN4IR is the first time I've just been able to play a game without actually thinking about how the controls are working. Once you get all of the calibration set up within the test menu of the arcade game itself and you change the settings over in the Supermodel UI, this just basically removes the barrier between the controls and the gameplay. Just like when you're in arcade, you weren't thinking about which controller you were using or how well it was calibrated, you just sat down and enjoyed the game, and this is the first time I haven't had to do much setup, and once the setup is complete, it just works. But let's move over to something like Lost World Jurassic Park, because this does not use the XY potentiometer guns from LA Machineguns, but this uses more of a traditional light gun setup, so we're going to have to do its own calibration within the test menu. So if you go into the test settings, you're going to see gun settings. You can do a gun mark check. What I'm going to do is basically put the iron sights of the GUN4IR right in front of the camera, so it's like you're looking through my eyes. I want to explain to you visually how this works. As I line it up here, you're going to see that the cursor in real time is not lined up. It's high and to the left. So if we go through every single target here, iterating through right, left, top, bottom, and center, and we aim at all 5 of those as we cycle through in the calibration setting, when I put the GUN4IR in front of you now, you're going to see, outside of a slight issue with the camera angle, that the reticle is rock solid in between those iron sights, and now I don't have to have a cursor, I don't have to have a crosshair. I can shoot or not shoot the dinosaurs as they come towards me, as good or as bad as my aim will allow. The GUN4IR is hitting the mark 100% of the time. If you miss a shot, that's because you were not aiming at the right space at the right time. And I use the button on the left as the reload versus shoot off screen, because when I'm doing 16:9 widescreen, it's too much of a swing for me. I really enjoy using that left button because that's how I'm holding the GUN4IR anyway. I may as well make that speed reloading on my left thumb be something that I utilize. But this is another absolutely epic Sega arcade game, and this is a direct capture from my laptop as I was doing this, and it works so well with GUN4IR. It's also not the most common cabinet you're going to see these days, so having the ability to play it at home is just going to be spectacular. Or something like the Ocean Hunter, another 10 out of 10 awesome Sega light gun game. This also uses XY coordinate guns, not light guns, but Supermodel actually takes the mouse coordinates on the X and Y axes and converts them over to analog controls when you're using X input. And when you have GUN4IR in mouse mode with those 4 IR sensors, that is how you're getting the control, and there's no other software in between this. I don't have Emulation or anything else running. This is just the GUN4IR software and the Supermodel software. And you'll see here I actually broke the graphics in the background just a bit, but I did that intentionally so you can see the cursor more readily move across the screen in real time with those textures missing. And if you guys want a Supermodel emulator tutorial update as well, just leave me a comment down below and tell me about that. But this is just another great instance of how good this product actually is. But there's other games on Model 3 as well that are light gun shooters as well as other things. Something like Wars Trilogy Arcade here. This used basically a flight stick that you would control on a cabinet, and interestingly enough, there's a cabinet about 1/4 of a mile from my house at a barcade, and I have played this recently. But when you play it at home, you either use an analog controller, a flight stick, or a mouse. And this game with GUN4IR totally works. You just hold down the trigger, you have your shots, but there's other areas in the game where you need to move your controller around to actually fight Darth Vader. You just basically pistol whip him with the GUN4IR and it works. This is the type of game that just pivots over so well to the GUN4IR functionality, and it just 100% works 100% of the time. I know the joke on the channel is I say 100% a lot, but honestly, with GUN4IR, every single thing I've thrown at it has just worked. Model 2 emulation, Supermodel 3, MAME, DuckStation, Demule, Flycast for Dreamcast and NAOMI. Every single time I use an emulator with light gun games on GUN4IR, I have the absolute best experience I have had in years if I'm not in front of an arcade cabinet. So now you know you can use GUN4IR for Supermodel 3, and it is a 10 out of 10 great time. Just make sure you follow the steps and you calibrate the aim in the arcade game menus. For that, we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.